Welcome to the January author conversation for the 2019-2020 Marginal Syllabus. This project convenes and sustains equity conversations in the margins of texts online using a digital annotation tool called Hypothesis. I'm Joe Dillon from the Denver Writing Project. I teach humanities to seniors at Gateway High in Aurora, Colorado. I'll be your host for this conversation. We've got a small panel of project collaborators here to discuss this month's reading with author Alex Corbitt. The reading is entitled Revising Resistance, A Step Toward Student-Centered Activism. Before we hear from Alex, I'd like to just introduce our panel. Would you guys go ahead and please introduce yourselves?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Christina Cantrell, Associate Director of the National Programs at the National Writing Project. And it's my great honor to work for the National Writing Project and to work with this team on Marginal Syllabus.
Hey everybody, my name is Rami Kalir. I'm an assistant professor of learning design and technology at the University of Colorado in Denver, and I'm one of the co-founders and co-facilitators of the Marginal Syllabus.
Terrific, thank you for that. And Alex, we're thrilled to have you, and we'll thank you a number of times for lending us permission to use your article and for joining us today. It would be great for us to hear a little bit of background about this piece from you. So really anything you think our readers would be interested in.
Sure. Thank you, everybody, for having me. And it's a blast to be able to contribute to this important work. I think just having been to your NCTE session this past month down in Baltimore, it's really clear that the work you could do to build conversation around articles, but also to decenter the author, right? And to center reader voices and perspectives and conversation. It's really exciting. And as we spoke about a little bit before we started recording, it's a real step into vulnerability. And I'm excited. And this is something new. And I'm learning as we go. I'll quickly introduce myself and then I'll give a little bit of background about the article. So my name is Alex Corbitt. I taught 7th grade literacies for 5 years in the Bronx, New York. At a small public middle school. And then after my 5 years, I just recently moved up to Boston to study curriculum and instruction up at Boston College. So I am in my 2nd year there, so I'm still a baby doctoral student, but I'm learning a lot, and this is a blast. So maybe I just jump in a little bit of background into the article. So I think the two people I want to thank the most who have really informed my thinking over the past few years, but also in the context of this article specifically, have been Jennifer Ochoa and Priscilla Thomas. And I'll tell two little kind of anecdotes maybe. First, this isn't my first time writing about the teen activism course that my students and I collaboratively designed. I have written about it in an upcoming book that Jen Ochoa is writing for NCTE called Students' Right to Read and Write in Middle-Level Classrooms. But I didn't write about it from the perspective of, or giving the history of how it was really born out of earlier failures in my teaching career. And that I tried to co-design the course with students as a way to kind of reflect and better my teaching from mistakes I had made in the past. And then second, Priscilla was a big collaborator. I don't think she quite knows this to the extent of it, but last fall of 2018, we were writing a chapter on trolling rhetoric and kind of the ethics of resisting trolling rhetoric. And as we were writing that piece, I was particularly like, okay, we need some ready-made strategies that teachers can implement into their classroom tomorrow. Like what works? How does, how can we be like, oh, this little part of our practice was really beneficial. And it turns out that the more we spoke about it, the messier the whole topic became. And we began to realize that we just had more questions at the end than we started with. And Priscilla really helped push my thinking by saying, hey, like, it's okay to just let our questions and some of our failures just kind of sit and be, because we've learned so much in that iterative reflective process. And even though we don't have answers, maybe that's not always the point. And maybe it's okay to be vulnerable. And so when I wrote this piece, I really tried to take Priscilla's advice to heart and for the first time be a little bit more explicit about how our teen activism course kind of came from a bunch of failures in my teaching practice. And that's kind of the theme of the article, reflecting on things that I didn't do well and I didn't negotiate and navigate well with kids in the context of social justice and activism, and ways that I tried to revise our resistance with students in subsequent years in my teaching. So that's kind of the history behind the article and kind of where I'm at now. And participating in this seems like a next step in that process too, because getting feedback from other readers and hearing perhaps their stories and creating a space for reflection feels right. So I'm really excited to be part of this.
Thank you so much for that helpful background. And we're thrilled to have you. And I think the piece, I'm excited to discuss the piece. So before we jump in and start sharing our notes and pose questions to you, et cetera, I'd just like to offer Raimi a chance to explain a little bit more about this project and what we think we're doing with the marginal syllabus in this particular webinar.
Yeah, thanks again. Thanks, Joe, Christina, and of course, Alex. Again, thank you so much for joining us as a partner author for our January article conversation in what is the 4th year of the marginal syllabus. And this project began in 2016, as Joe mentioned earlier, to spark and sustain conversations using collaborative technologies and through collaborative partnerships. And over the past few years, those collaborative partnerships have grown to include, as Christina mentioned, the National Writing Project, and also the past 2 years, the National Council of Teachers of English. And we are especially appreciative of the access to scholarship, to articles to read and discuss that NCTE has provided. Again, the article that Alex has shared with us and all the articles that are shared in the current 2019-2020 LEARN syllabus are all from NCTE journals. We talk about the marginal syllabus. We do so through very intentional references to the term marginal. I think that's important to know if you're hearing about the project for the first time, or even if you're reorienting yourself to this work, perhaps because you participated maybe at this point years ago and are rejoining our efforts. The first interpretation of marginal that we pick up concerns the engagement with marginal perspectives. We are, in some respects, reading literature, talking about topics, and appreciating the scholarship of authors like Alex, whose perspectives are really a counter-narrative to the status quo of schooling that really challenges, in many ways, the entrenched inequities of the American public education system. And so there's a marginal appreciation there for perspectives and stances that very much resists, to pick up on a theme of Alex's writing, again, the status quo of schooling. We're also, as this conversation transitions into an online space, having conversations in the margins of online texts. And as Joe mentioned at the top of this webinar, we use a free, open source, and collaborative annotation technology called Hypothesis in order to open up marginal spaces to have conversations amongst interested educators, people who want to read and then comment on and discuss, in this case, Alex, your article. And then the last thing we'll mention again is that we are encouraging educators to take a kind of, again, contrary approach to their professional learning. Somebody, Alex, you just mentioned the NCTE annual convention. We were having conversations with a number of friends and collaborators in that space, and somebody mentioned that the marginal syllabus is almost like a guerrilla PD. It's a kind of opening up of spaces for educators to pursue their own learning, because perhaps their school or their district or other professional opportunities don't kind of scratch the itch that they're looking for. And so I think that, again, that idea of guerrilla professional development really captures the ethos of the kind of marginal work that we see ourselves doing through this project. So I'll keep it there. You can, of course, learn more about the marginal syllabus by following us on Twitter. The hashtag marginal syllabus is a great place to find resources. We have a project website, and those resources and others will be linked through this webinar and the various resources that accompany this post. So I'll leave the project background there. It's great to be working with Alex this month.
Terrific, thank you. And so now I know that we're all excited to discuss this article, and I personally have marked up my paper copy that I printed out. And I want to invite you, Christina, to maybe get our discussion started by sharing any notes or questions you have.
Sure, thank you. I should also introduce my cat, Marcy, who's here for the ride. So, Alex, I loved digging back into this piece today. I'd read it earlier. Shelby Whitty, who's the editor of Voices from the Middle, had recommended this piece. And the minute I read it, I thought, oh yeah, this is a great piece for us to dig into. And from a writing project perspective, where we're sort of all learning together as educators, it really struck me as a powerful piece and a very powerful narrative about your process. So when you talk about vulnerability, it makes, that's really what I can see, or what I felt in this. Like, wow, you really started us with quite a story, that then you talked about how you really sat with it for 2 years and really sort of thought about what happened and how can and also saw how you sort of backed away from certain things you were trying to do and then moved back towards them when you realized that actually that's what you felt was needed, right? So all the ways that you were experiencing this work, you really write and share with us. So so it does strike me as I so appreciate the vulnerability that you shared here and your sort of iterative process. And then what it made me want to ask more about is sort of the process of working together with colleagues. It sounds like Jen and Priscilla were facilitators at the New York City Writing Project Institute, right? And so working together with colleagues sort of brought you back to working on this with students. And I was wondering if you could tell us about that sort of process, or, talk a little bit more about that. You described it in the article, but I'd love to hear it from your own description. What was that process like, and what are the parallels there that you see?
Those are some great questions. You're making me think that I think the National Writing Project does it right in the sense that they're summer institutes. I know they've taken different shapes over the many years that the Writing Project has been around. But in 2016, when I did my institute in New York City, the format was we spent 2 weeks together, writing together, sharing our work together, being vulnerable, just thinking about the current political climate at the time with the 2016 election. And I think that form of kind of like a democratic space, building community, really informed my pedagogy going into that school year. I think about sometimes the limitations of big conference spaces because, especially like kind of sessions where people are sharing out their work, because I think sometimes there can be this like illusion that people are finished products, and that can be very intimidating, and I think it can also stunt growth for people kind of engaged with that learning, because it kind of puts a tidy bow on things, and then we don't kind of continue that iterative reflective process. And I think at its worst, the education space can sometimes have this weird guru culture with some certain folks, and I think that is actually antithetical to changing systems and better serving kids. So I think the National Writing Project, and when I'm kind of in spaces like unconference spaces where people kind of more democratically navigate their own learning, I think that was really the inspiration for some of the work that I did with my kids with 7th and 8th grade students, where we kind of co-negotiated the trajectories and content of the course. And so, yeah, I do owe a lot to the National Writing Project and Jen and Priscilla. I'm not sure, did I answer your question, Christina, or did I veer off into a...
No, I think that's great. I mean, I do think that there's this, this opportunity to do that kind of work with each other that gives us the ability to then think about how we could do it with kids and vice versa, right? So there's a real relationship between those things that I think is very powerful. And I appreciate the way that you talk about it as a potentially, a force for change, that in itself is an actual force for change. So
yeah, and I really appreciate, I really appreciate the way Christina pointed out something that was awesome to me in the article, that it's just a really cool artifact of reflective practice, right? So the idea is like, there's some teaching that you had planned to do, and then as you were teaching, you were kind of rethinking what you were doing. And specifically, you were talking about this unit, and I think it was called Mistakes and Challenges Unit. And as part of that, you were looking at the stop and frisk policy in New York, and then you wrote this really powerful sentence. It says, "But as I sat in the police precinct with your students, right, watching the officer lecture, it became very clear that I had perpetuated injustice. Where had I gone wrong?" Now, I mean, that is the line I would say is, really powerful in terms of here's some reflective practice, right? And I also think like it's powerful because teachers so often, they experience the change process in reflective iteration, right? Period 1 doesn't go real well, and we'll make some corrections, and period 2 goes a little better. And oftentimes when teachers are sort of like worried about changes that are being imposed upon them or changes that are suggested through PD, a lot of times noticing those small reflective moves in classes or from one class to another just kind of can help a teacher in the day-to-day moments see the power of reflective practice, making period 2 go a little better than period 1. And I think your article is really it's profound in the sense that you have a community of practice that helped you kind of like work through this tension that was clearly happening on a bigger scale, and tied in with your activist bent as a teacher. I think it speaks to the power of the network. I think it speaks to the power of your own reflection and your desire to grow as a teacher. And again, that sentence kind of sticks with me. I personally would love to hear more about that sentence or that moment.
Sure. I was very much struggling to even decide if I wanted to put that vignette in the piece, because I really want to be careful with the way I navigate talking about working with my kids and my community in a way that also really highlights the strength and the brilliance of the community that I care for very, very much. And so I didn't want to create this narrative where I don't know, I was portraying my community in any way that makes them less than the incredible brilliance that they are. That said, I think that scene in the police precinct was a reflection of my shortcomings, and actually the kids and the community in which I worked, their strength comes out, and their inherent wisdom and voice comes out when I shut up, I listen, and then they kind of take the reins. Also, I think it's funny how we are in these spaces where it's a lot of adults talking about what kids need, but kind of the mind-blowing but also very kind of common sense realization I came to was like, ask kids what they need, talk to kids, build community, right? Listen, and they know what they need. Not all the times, but most of the time. So yeah, just listening, and but that also requires a leap of faith too, because I think as a teacher sometimes I have trouble letting go of a certain amount of authority, because it's like, oh, I'm afraid the classroom dynamic is maybe going to veer off if I'm like, hey, what could I do better in my teaching? Or, I'm not kind of portraying this facade of a teacher who's very well planned and knows how every lesson is supposed to go, what our takeaways are going to be. But as I became more comfortable kind of navigating that, I felt like I could co-create more space for student voice. I don't know if hope that makes sense.
Yeah. So Alex, is that like, so some of your comments, just in the last few moments here around listening, listening to students as they talk because they know what they need. I'm just referencing my notes here as you were speaking. This idea of letting go of the facade of control. Is that helping us to kind of take a step towards this phrase that you use, which I love this phrase, and I've been thinking about it since I've read your piece, of pedagogical justice? Does that help us to kind of move towards that direction of pedagogical justice? And maybe I should just mention briefly that I think that phrase stuck out to me so much because you only use it once in the piece, which I think suggests that it has this kind of singular resonance. At the same time, it gave me a lot of curiosity. What does this actually look like? And how does pedagogical justice enact it? How does it move in a classroom? What are the things that an educator does to enable this type of justice? And also because I see it as a perhaps quite generative, I don't know if foil is the right word, but maybe I'll just say foil to what I think is often an overused term, which is of course social justice. And I'll just mention briefly that I think that term gets used a lot by a lot of people who might not have as much of a strong grounding in or sense of what that term may mean or could mean or doesn't mean. And I've actually stopped using that term a lot in reference to work that I do, or even more specifically, even this project. And I should say, and I've said it before, that I've never suggested that marginal syllabus work is somehow enacting social justice, because I don't believe that that's what this project does. And yet there are, of course, many educators, and you spoke a few moments ago, Alex, it's kind of like a guru culture. And I feel like there are these kinds of like almost, very kinds of superficial kind of cultural tropes now that kind of get tossed around in certain circles. And social justice sometimes becomes aligned with some of that. Which is all just to say that when you use a term like pedagogical justice, it strikes me as being very intentional, perhaps reflective of the need to shift some of that language. And again, given some of what you just mentioned, grounded in some very concrete pedagogical practices that do provide a sense of agency, responsiveness, and real authentic voice for students to actually direct their learning. So anyways, I'll stop rambling. But I am really curious to get a sense from you of what it is that you mean by pedagogical justice, and perhaps maybe how that does relate to broader concerns about and maybe work towards social justice.
Yeah, I guess when I think about like ideas of social justice or pedagogical justice, I try and make the distinction between content and process. And I think that folks feel like, oh, if we talk about or we study the content of stop and frisk, or kids as young as, at the time in 2013, kids as young as 16 could be put in solitary confinement at Rikers Island. And so there's this sense that, oh, if we're talking about it, then that is, equity work or justice work, right? But that's the content. The process of it was completely silencing of my students. I felt good. I felt like I was doing what I should as a first-year teacher and jumping on in there, but the process was all screwed up, and it wasn't equitable, and my kids weren't being heard. So then when I think of pedagogical justice, the pedagogy part of it seems to focus more on the process of community building and kind of shared epistemologies and shared inquiry. But even the word pedagogical gets a little sticky, because I think when we think of pedagogy, we kind of think of this unidirectional, I mean, it shouldn't be, but I think sometimes it gets associated with a unidirectional form of instruction where it's like, oh, what pedagogies are the teachers facilitating? Whereas I think that should be problematized a little bit, and we should kind of think of pedagogical justice or equitable learning moments as these moments of bi-directional inquiry, learning, listening, that kind of problematize also the apparatus of school and all the ways that schooling forces us to organize ourselves.
So I'll jump in, Joe. Is that okay? Okay. Alex, I love the way that you talk about the things that you learned through this project in these 4 ways. And one of them is you talk about, this distinction between teaching about social justice and teaching for social justice, taking that stance of that this is a process, actually. It's not, but then another piece of what you're really saying you're learning is that both by listening to your students, it helped you address both their needs and passion. So being able to figure out exactly what it is that served them was about listening, and that you found that they often had a greater capacity to explore complexity than you personally did. So it's like being able to sort of co-construct these things with you really developed your own ideas. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, just even from talk through a little bit how you talk about a process where you were, let's see, so I have to get my, you had a 3-step process that you did in the classroom. And, oh, maybe someone can help me find it. Okay, brainstorm, curate, vote, right? So this sort of, you can really see this sort of like this active cycling, or I felt like throughout your article, there's this active, like iterative thing that you were doing. And even with the kids, there's like a very iterative process. So I was wondering if you could just like talk a little bit about being in that classroom again and sort of how that evolved. And it felt to me as you're telling the story that we start to see like you negotiating those spaces. Like it's not all, they're not running everything, nor are you running everything. You start to find this sort of middle space too. So I just found your descriptions really provocative, and I'd love to hear you talk about them a little bit more.
Yeah. So I will say, and I think I mentioned this in the article, but just a caveat, the course was roughly like 15 kids. And so it wasn't a classroom of 34. And does this model scale to a class of 34? I don't know. And so I'll just throw that right out on the table, and I won't claim that it does. But I think it's also, that doesn't mean it's not worth playing with and trying. So we would sit in a circle in the front of the classroom, and there was a whiteboard, and we would, every session, sometimes we would be biting into or chewing on a text that lasted multiple days. For example, when we were watching 13th on Netflix, based on Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, we kind of didn't have to negotiate what we were going to do for those few days because we were kind of processing that. But on days where we were doing, thinking through a few texts, doing some activities, having certain conversations that have been pressing for certain students, and they said, oh, we want to kind of talk about this, we would do this brainstorm or this brain dump on the whiteboard where we would kind of put everything that we've been wanting to talk about, and then we would curate and put stars next to certain topics that we wanted to discuss, or maybe we would decide on collaboratively an order in which we wanted to discuss or investigate certain things, and then we would kind of go from there. And to your point, Christina, there were times when it felt like the kids were almost running all of this on their own, and I was just kind of sitting and kind of observing and participating to a point. And then there were times in the school year where it's just, we're all looking at each other and we're like, oh, okay. It's like it's the middle of March. We're still doing this, and we're all tired. And there were times when the kids were like, you figure out what we're doing because we're tired. And we kind of would negotiate that too. And sometimes they would bring texts forward or articles that they want to talk about. And sometimes they're like, well, what do you have, Mr. Corbett? And then I would kind of do work on the back end to bring forward texts and things for us to do. Also, the length of the units varied wildly because we stopped when the kids felt like it was ready to move on to a new topic. So sometimes it would just be like, are we done? I don't know. Like, where are we at? And so, the sequencing looked very interesting. Like we spent almost, or even past the holiday break into probably early January, talking about systemic racism and the prison industrial complex. Like that was a long inquiry and investigation and took a lot of talking. The kids negotiated kind of safety protocols. Like if there were moments that were potentially triggering, we would stop conversations and go jump into a different item on our list, or sometimes play like a team building game that was lighthearted. So we had the flexibility to kind of move in those fluid ways. But again, I will say that it was very helpful to have a small, like almost like a half class size, like 15 or so kids.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I appreciate you saying that. And I think there's something powerful about these dynamic ways of being able to sort of stretch things and follow an inquiry as far as it goes. And one of the, I'd want Joe to jump in here. I was also struck just by sort of some of the things that you generated out of those inquiry. You know, they weren't just sort of inquiry for inquiry's sake. They generated things for the community that then engaged the community in some of these ideas and questions. So that seemed like a powerful piece of it too. So we could talk about that. Or Joe, do you have something that you wanted to jump in with?
No, I appreciate it. I would love to hear about specifically, like, you talked about the PSAs that students created. I think that would be interesting to hear about in terms of the forms of composition that you tinkered with. If I can, though, maybe before we get to that, I want to circle back to what you said earlier in terms of like when you asserted that the students know what they need. And I think, having taught middle school myself, right now I teach high school, I think that, any given group of middle schoolers, I like to believe that they do know what they need. But, they're middle schoolers, and sometimes we look at them and go, I'm not so sure. But what really resonates with me about what you said, though, is that particularly as we're interested in engaging them, and we're interested in stoking their interests, that's a place where we absolutely have to hear from them, even on days where they want to eat hot Cheetos for breakfast, lunch, and dinner or something, right? And so I really appreciate how if you want to engage them, then there should be a conversation about what they want to learn. And then you also wrote about the games you needed to play to sometimes lighten the mood. And you wrote, the group collaboratively agreed to establish a safety protocol in which we immediately pause the discussion and play a lighthearted team building game. Anyone in class could initiate the safety protocol if they felt overwhelmed. And so again, I think that's a place where you have prioritization as a class and as a teacher, and then you're also really thinking about like interest, safety, and how the students are feeling. So I just wonder if you can speak more about maybe those ideas.
It's funny to hear. You're right that sometimes it's like, do middle schoolers always know what they need? I don't know. That got me. I had something to say about that. I just don't think meaningful learning happens until you have almost like this this consent of inquiry. Like you can't force information down into kids' heads if ever, but also like covering content if kids aren't coming to it with authentic or meaningful or personal inquiries, learning doesn't happen. So also thinking about like, I don't know, I'm very, it seems very important to me that in class we're always trying to do things and talk about things that feel pressing, that feel that like it's on kids' minds, or that we feel like we're having fun. And that might sometimes, you know, I think it's important to have fun, because I think that means that there's a level of like intellectual consent or something. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think you need to kids need to show teachers that they're ready to learn certain things and content. I think I'm rambling a little bit too. As far as like the safety protocol goes, I think one thing that maybe certain folks might kind of question right away is like, oh, well, like they might look at something like that with suspicion and be like, oh, well, did they abuse that? Would they just, you know, say, oh, I don't want to talk about this right now. Let's do something different. I'm bored. But to be fair, I found like when we created a community of trust, and I don't want to say a safe space, because I've heard lots of thinkers kind of problematize the idea of a safe space, right? Like, is it ever truly a safe space when, you know, given my positionality and that I'm a person in power and I'm a white man who grew up in suburbs of New Jersey, like, is it really ever a safe space? And I would argue no. But I think we develop a certain level of trust where, I don't know, it feels less of like I'm running it, and if kids are discussing things that they really want to discuss, taking a break isn't like taking a step away from the curriculum that I've created, because it didn't come from me. It came from the kids, right? So no, like that was real, and I had a deep trust that if kids were like, let's take a step back for a second, let's switch gears. I had a deep trust that kids were being very sincere about that, primarily because typically we were trying to talk about questions that they raised in the first place. It wasn't my content always to begin with, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I want to. There's so much to unpack here, Alex. I just so appreciate the layers that are here. But I'm so curious to know a little bit more about this anonymous zine that you all produced. Let me just say this, because Alex, I think we mentioned this briefly to one another when we saw each other recently. But you know, I also was a middle school teacher at one point in my life in the South Bronx. I could have never imagined when I was in that position dropping anonymous zines off in the entire school's lockers, you know, there were so many risks that I felt like perhaps, and maybe I just perceived this in reading your article, there were so many risks that you took, not only pedagogically, as we were talking about earlier, but potentially also professionally, and also risks, and again, opening up new ways of relating to your students. And I'm curious how, again, some of these, whether it's the composing practices, it's the artifacts that you created, it's the narrative that you were putting out into the community, how that changed your relationship to your students, perhaps in the kinds of conversations that you were able to have. You were just talking about some sense of trust. Again, I really agree with you in terms of maybe not, you know, categorizing certain spaces as ones that are safe, but certainly, again, you're building new trust. And I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit more about how the work that you were doing, the things that you were creating, the discourses that you were sparking, the conversations that you helped to enact beyond the walls of your classroom, ultimately changed the way that you were able to relate to your students.
I can run and get a copy, like a laminated copy of the zine, to show you guys in a second.
Have a copy? Oh my God.
Yeah, I have it. Hold on.
About that. Like, oh my goodness. So this is, wow, that's getting a copy of the zine. We should see if we can. Anyway. Amazing.
I love this. Yes.
Oh
this is
my
exact.
God. Here it is.
Okay. This is one of the issues.
Oh, wow. Awesome.
And when we made copies of it, photocopies, it was all black and white, but like magazine clippings and stuff. Yeah, and like talking about the messiness of it, it was never a totally like clean process where everything kind of, it was never clear how to proceed in the way that was best for all students. But one thing that I kind of chewed on with the zine is that a lot of kids wanted their contributions to be anonymous, or they wanted to have like monikers that were kind of edgy. And I think the idea of an anonymous zine was very exciting for the kids. And I also think it, I don't know, it gave them a certain amount of distance where they felt like they could say what they had to say, but still have a layer of anonymity. But then also balancing that with like, to what extent should I say, guys, like, you know, own it and be proud of your work. And but I tried to kind of follow their lead there and allow them to do what they were ready to do and comfortable to do, and that. So, and then also we didn't do anything without the consent of other teachers, or like my administrator was great, and she kind of let me and the kids kind of go wild with it. But like all the lockers were in teachers' classrooms. So if there were some teachers who were like, nope, that's not how I'm starting my day tomorrow. Like, it's like, okay, no problem. Like we'll take a step back and we'll give you your space. But it seemed like most of the teachers, I mean, almost all the teachers were down for that. And to be fair, there were certain spaces and rooms where it created a lot of buzz and a lot of conversations, and then there were certain rooms where it fell flat and kids were like, what's this? You know, so it wasn't like this transcendent moment where all these incredible conversations were exploding. It was a mixed bag, like middle school can be. But then it was cool debriefing that as a group later that day, and debriefing everybody's experience in the Teen Activism Club, like what they saw, what they noticed, what they overheard, maybe how they were able to enter into some of these conversations without folks knowing that they were actually one of the people, you know, who they were reading and talking about. So just interesting kind of reflecting on that with kids too.
Just a quick point of clarification. I think that, because I thought it was really powerful how you talked about how you posed a course. It seems like the students originally had kind of settled on a documentary film course, and then you kind of floated an idea with the students, right? And then you were just talking about it, and it does sound like you're mixing a little bit of like a student interest club space with a course space. But how did you see those two things blending? Was it more course-ish than club-ish, or how would you describe it?
I think the vibe definitely felt more clubby. But it's interesting, like the weight that those two words carry, right? Like it's a course when the teacher's running it, it's a club when the kids are running it. Like it's interesting how those words also, they conjure up so much of this, like it's like loaded in a way. But when we were gonna initially do a documentary film class, that didn't bubble up out of student interest. That was just something that the school had offered, and I had kind of offered to facilitate that. So it wasn't something that had been agreed upon, just kids had been put into some kids had elected to be in it, but then other kids had just been put into, you know, my documentary film extracurricular course. And so, but I'm sorry, it wasn't extracurricular because it took place during the school day. So it was part of, you know, it was a regular course. No, I think when we switched it to a teen activism focus, that was the first time that it was like, hey, I have this idea, but I kind of want to flesh it out with you guys. What do you think? And I think that was the first time that their voices were a part of the design of the course. That when it had been, it wasn't like they had all signed up for documentary film and then I flipped it on them. That was not, they weren't a part of that conversation. Then when we were designing the teen activism or refashioning it into a teen activism class, that was when they had some sort of input.
I was going to ask you about the fourth thing that you said you learned, which was about building off the zine or the PSAs, that the kids, their preferred audience was actually their peers. And I was really interested in that just because I recently taught a graduate course, a teaching writing online graduate course, and I was encouraging a lot of sort of sharing or experimenting with sharing in different kinds of spaces, and thought that I got sort of different levels of comfort with that, like thinking about supporting youth in their writing and how to share it, and then thinking about, oh right, we should be asking the kids who they want, like what matters to them in terms of their sharing, and where would they like to share it, and then and I don't know. I mean, I was struck by the it seemed like the decisions were often actually continue to build community through sharing in your space, and you were experimenting with different forms, like some were not anonymous and some were anonymous, and playing with different ways to be in public, kind of, but as a community, if that makes sense. So I just very curious about like what you thought about those designs and how you all designed them together.
Yeah, I think it started off with like what would be a neat way to kind of express our learning, and we did like kind of a brainstorming there, and then we were like, how do we negotiate that sharing, and what positions do we take as far as like how transparent our identities are, or who we decide to be in dialogue with. As I mentioned in the article, I had this preconceived notion in my first year of teaching, like, oh, well, it's not authentic, quote unquote authentic, or it does, does it really count on if we don't reach out to policymakers and folks at more of a kind of a political or community level in that way? And then I also had the preconceived notion, oh, it's not, it's not social justice work or equity work unless we're talking about like anti-racism or the prison industrial complex. But all those things are very valuable. Like, and they are of utmost importance. But it doesn't end there, I guess, is where the conversation doesn't end there. And a lot of kids really want to talk about mental health. Not that is completely unrelated to those other things, right? Like a lot of these things kind of converge in many complicated ways, but kids also want to talk about drug use and bullying and body image. And so just reminding me that social justice isn't reducible to only a couple topics. And I was very surprised because I would keep being like, oh, well, do we want to have an audience beyond, the school or our peers? And in the context of this class course whatever club, they were like, no, we're good. No, this is good. And like, that's where they were at. It's like, okay, like I will back up a little bit. And that was kind of interesting, but it also kind of makes sense because the school community and their friends, that is the community that they're invested in, and they work to sustain on a day-to-day basis. So I don't know, it also in a way makes sense too.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me, or the sense I thought I was making of it. It's like living in a democracy, right? Like you need a chance to like practice these things. You need to practice being a participant. And that this space is allowing the kids to practice being participants. So why don't they just practice where they are? They probably don't get a lot of practice in school in these ways, right? So I don't know, I was just thinking about how we designed for this stuff, that we really need to think about how that these practices, I mean, I think that's what you're offering here, is that these practices themselves are build justice, right? We build it together when we do these processes together. You said it much more eloquently. But
and to be fair, I mean, if I think it would take the inquiries and the projects that we work on would take it. You know, I only did this for 1 year, but I imagine if I did it for multiple years, they would take wildly different shapes. And that's really exciting. I didn't get the chance to kind of see that or experience that, but that's really exciting too. So I think the article is simply just a snapshot. It doesn't. It's not I don't claim that it's transferable in other spaces. I just think it's kind of like just a snapshot of just cool things that kids do, and the agency that kids have when we create space for their inherent agency.
Great. Yeah. Thank you.
Alex, thank you so much for that. And I think it's also a good place for us to sort of think about our, maybe like our final takeaways from this article, because we sure appreciate you diving into this, this article that, again, is just a really profound artifact of reflective practice, I think. So, and I'll go first since I'm challenging everybody with a final thought. I guess I think that, to me, I appreciate the, the way you followed students' interests and the idea that things would in fact take a different shape. It's very easy for me to see in the article what you just said is true, that given a different group of students, given a different year, and maybe different things happening in the world, that the course would be different. And I think that there's a level of responsiveness there and interest-driven design work that's just powerful. So it inspires me. It'll inspire me in my teaching. So thank you for that. Raimi, can I invite you?
Yeah, again, Alex, I just want to thank you so much for joining the Marginal Syllabus in January as our partner author in the current syllabus. And, Alex, you just mentioned that the article is a snapshot, and I appreciate that. I wrote that down. But I'm thinking now that it's a snapshot that captures, however, real deep change. That yes, the article and your voice is so provocative, and the storytelling and the way in which you weave the narrative together with some very important, ideas and some really provocative kind of reveals, like the one at the end, which I won't give away, but this kind of indoctrination to certain kinds of progressive ideologies and how that perhaps is not respectful of or responsive to students' actual inquiry. It's great, and I look forward to reading it online and annotating it online, as we will do soon. But again, it may indeed be a snapshot, Alex. But I just want to thank you for sharing with us a snapshot of really what is indicative of just really deep, significant work and real changes in your both beliefs and practices as an educator. I know I'll be chewing on this idea of pedagogical justice that is bi-directional, as you mentioned, for a long time, and I hope to listen as deeply and learn as fully as you've demonstrated in this piece. So just again, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this with us.
I also wanted to pick up on that idea of the snapshot. It's very helpful and very grounding, and in my work, I've had a chance to work with a project called LRG Innovators, where we've put out challenges for folks to design around youth interest and design with youth. And thinking about the power of the snapshots that have come out of those projects too, and thinking about the power of those together makes me very excited and wanting to think and talk more with our colleagues about what are some moments like this in our own practice, and what can we surface together that speaks to some of the ways that we might want to design forward. So anyway, I just greatly appreciate you sharing this work and being vulnerable and sharing this work. It's very powerful.
Thank you guys for having me. And I'm kind of, I think I'm really interested now to see the annotations that take place and see, you know, are there ways that readers push back and or different experiences that readers have had, and really trying to decenter the article now. So I'm excited for that aspect of it.
Awesome. Well, again, Alex, we can't thank you enough for joining us, and thanks for this awesome conversation. We want to thank the viewers who watch this webinar. And again, this project it's Literacy, Equity, and Remarkable Notes, and the acronym is LEARN, and it's this partnership where the Marginal Syllabus is working with the National Writing Project and NCTE, and of course the tool Hypothesis. So we're really appreciative of, again, you are joining us, and then everybody who's checking out the project, and we're inviting into the margins of your article. Again, this article, Revising Resistance, A Step Towards Student-Centered Activism, will be online in January, and is accessible for participant annotations at the beginning of that month. And you can find it at educatorinnovator.org. Now, for updates on the project, please subscribe to our blog and sign up for a monthly newsletter at educatorinnovator.org. Follow us at @innovates_ed. And then please use the hashtag marginal syllabus when you're sharing your work or promoting our project. So thanks, everyone.